Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. If you're new here, consider subscribing. It really helps keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now, sit back, relax, and let's get into the story. I cut the engine at the service road turnout and let the silence take the shape of the base I knew better than my own apartment. The nameplate on the concrete sign was still there, dusted with pine pollen. The same letters I had passed 200 times with a box of spiral pastries and a plastic bin of replacement coin mechs in the passenger seat. Tonight, I was not wearing the vendor badge. The badge reader on the pedestrian gate blinked a patient red in the dusk, and the main motor pool beyond it sat like a giant shadow with square shoulders. I breathed in diesel, pine, and the metal scent that lives in every motor pool and every food service back room. I had not come for groceries or a service call. I had come for time. The outbreak flipped the town in 2 days. On the first morning, I was answering texts from the contracting office that the dining facility would pause non-essential deliveries. By the second night, the news feeds were a ribbon of emergency messages, and the main roads were a choreographed standstill. The soldiers at the gate stopped checking IDs. Then the gate was empty. The third day, I hid in my shop, counting the cans, tracing fuel lines on my generator, and listening to the faraway sound of a siren that never seemed to get closer or fade. On the fourth night, I drove here by muscle memory, coasting the last half mile with the lights off, using the glow of the exit signs and years of habit to thread between the concrete barriers. I knew the base like a blueprint because I had studied the blueprints. Food service machines are unforgiving when you do not know what grows warm, what vibrates, what trips the breaker at the exact wrong time. I had traced conduits with my finger on laminated maps while waiting for officers' meetings to let out so I could refill a machine in the command building lobby. I knew which buildings had emergency generator hookups and which had standby generators actually installed. I knew that the mess hall had a sealed refrigeration room that could hold temperature for hours, even with the power off. And I knew the little way you could lift the crash bar on the back door of the logistics building to avoid setting off the alarm. I knew the schedule of guard rotations from 100 friendly greetings and 1,000 shared coffees. The gate guard shack door stood open, papers trapped under a stapler on the desk. I slid past the turnstile and hugged the shadow of the administrative wing. My boots made a dry whisper on the concrete. The base had power, but not the normal flood of it. No bright parking lot lights, no buzzing amphitheater glow. The light was a restrained, careful kind, the kind produced by a generator that has been told to hold on and do only what must be done. The main feeders were dark, but the command building had a warm rectangle of light in one window on the second floor. The window, I knew, contained the duty officer console and the video wall. If the video wall was on, the backup system was alive. I slipped the side door card reader. The indicator stayed red, but the fail-safe mechanical cylinder took my old key. The same key I kept from a night last winter when a lock seized and the duty sergeant waved his hand and said, "Just hold on to it for next week." The tumblers turned with a reluctant click. The door pushed open into a corridor that smelled like floor wax and cold air from vents that were still breathing. In the distance, a unit patch on the wall looked back at me, the colors washed to a grayscale by emergency lighting. My first stop was the mess hall because shelter beats information when the sun is dropping and confidence is a shallow pocket. The kitchen was a museum after hours. Stainless steel worktops, a row of kettles, the heavy hood over the range, and the old familiar hum of the walk-in. The hum meant the sealed refrigeration room's compressor was still cycling. The door to that room was foam-insulated steel with a lever handle outside and a safety release inside. If the main power dropped, the room would hold cold a long time. It would also hold a person. I dragged 2 wire food racks on their casters and turned them sideways, wedging a stack of cafeteria trays between the door handle and the rack uprights to transform a simple latch into something that required effort. I had done this trick once to keep teenagers from sneaking into the walk-in during a holiday party. The trays under compression sat like a spring pack. I added a column of gallon jugs of water and a stack of rice bags as padding against the door, not because I thought anything would explode, but because mass and friction are friends when you want a door to resist a shove. The floor tiles had hairline cracks that I had looked at a dozen times while waiting for the French fries to be restocked. Those cracks were still there as if time had not moved, even though everything else in the world had. I stood inside the walk-in for a moment, listening to the sealed quiet. The air had the precise smell of cold food and rubber door gaskets. I turned on the small flashlight I kept in my pocket. Shelves of trays wrapped in film, pans labeled with dates. A sealed crate of field rations sat on the lower shelf, brown plastic envelopes in their cardboard homes. Someone had opened another crate and taken half. I counted by habit, 12 left in the open box, a full case sealed. 18 meals a day if I pushed portions, or more days if I stretched and boiled rice. I put my backpack on the top shelf and breathed slowly until my heartbeat aligned with the compressor cycle. The command center called to me like the only light in a dark campsite. I left the walk-in door closed but not latched, then backed my barricade into place. Trays wedged, jugs leaning, the geometry of resistance complete. I made my way up the corridor, past the vending machine in the lobby that I had filled more times than I could count. A temporary shutdown sign hung crooked on it, a piece of masking tape tearing away from the plastic. I reached the stairwell and climbed to the second floor. The command center door had a keypad and a badge reader, but I had spent enough nights here to know the auxiliary door's hinge pins were accessible from a ceiling panel above the hallway. I popped the panel, slid forward prone, and reached down with my multi-tool to pull the small retaining clip. The door gave me its secret with a quiet sigh. Inside, the video wall was alive but sleeping. The feeds showed a cycle of perimeter cameras, a histogram of generator load, and a clock set to local time. The lighting was set to low, like a theater in intermission. The generator status board reported one of the two main diesel generators at 70% load, the other in standby. The system identified them by model, two 400 kilowatt units rated for prime power, equipped with automatic transfer switches and day tanks. The software flagged the fuel level, 40% in the main tank, enough for a day or more if the load stayed light. A maintenance ticket from the 3 weeks ago reminded no one now that the fuel filters should be inspected. Another note said the monthly exercise run was successful. I touched the keyboard and woke the workstation. A login prompt asked for credentials I did not have, but the camera matrix ran on its own process, and the thermal overlay responded to the mouse. I selected the feed for the outer gate. A Humvee sat crooked near the fence line, one door open, the light bar dead, the front bumper nuzzling the chain link at an angle that said the driver had parked in a hurry or not at all. The timestamp scrolled in the corner. The software wrote 2 words in the overlay: motion detected. The detection box moved across an empty lane of asphalt and then cleared. I swapped through the cameras. The motor pool showed the familiar ranks of vehicles. The concrete floor, a flat ocean of oil stains. The drone station feed whispered alive in a small window, an unassuming interface that had always been a curiosity to me when I came up here to check the office machine. A pair of small quadcopters sat in their docking stations by the window. A sticker with a serial number reminded me that they were not toys. The status read ready, battery at 94%. I clicked the launch screen, and the software asked for a flight plan or manual control. I touched manual. The left drone stirred, unfolded, and lifted with a careful confidence that scared me, because it felt like the base itself remembered I existed. I flew the drone over the admin buildings and out toward the highway that cut past the base like a dark river. The road held no moving cars. A bus was stopped at the shoulder with its door open, its interior dim like a toothless mouth. On the shoulder, a jacket lay in a crumple beside a suitcase. I avoided zooming too close. In the drone's thermal view, trees glowed faintly where the last heat of the day clung. The asphalt was a muted band. The bus was colder than the ground, as if it had been sitting for hours. I turned the drone back over the base and drifted over the fence line, where a camera tower watched in a patient rotation. The command center's alert tone, a soft chime set not to startle, signaled a perimeter motion event. On the northeast camera, the software drew a rectangle and then another, then stopped. Nothing obvious moved. I watched a full minute and saw a branch return to stillness. I exhaled, realized I had been holding my breath, and put the drone to bed. The battery slid back into its dock and the motor's last whine faded. The command room settled into its signature sound. The steady lower frequency thrum of the generator translated through steel beams. I went back to the mess hall and made my bed in the cold. The sealed refrigeration room was not comfortable. The air smelled like onions and plastic and cold dairy, but comfort had moved down the list. Safety had moved up. I set my watch for a quiet alarm at 4:30 a.m., a time I had always liked for big tasks because the world is undecided then, and I dragged a crate of plastic utensils to sit under the lever handle inside the door, as insurance against the handle moving accidentally. I lay there on a folded tarp, listening to the compressor and the distant heartbeat of the generator, and I told myself the same thing. I told myself when fixing a machine that 8 coins. One change at a time, test after each change. Do not panic, do not hurry, do not cut corners that would be hard to uncut. By sunrise, I had a plan, because plans are what fill silence so it does not spill over. The plan was simple and cautious. Step 1, inventory. Step 2, center the base's systems in my mind, as if the base were a finicky machine with a long service history and a current complaint. Step 3, confirm power and fuel. Step 4, decide how long I could stay without drawing attention. I started with the armory cage in the supply annex, where I had moved my dolly a dozen times to avoid blocking the doorway. The cage was half open and half empty. The forms pinned to the ledger board showed neat signatures from the evacuation day. I saw names I knew by face if not by words, and words I knew by habit. Serial numbers, quantities, a notation for temporary issue. 3 service rifles remained on the lower rack, each with a chamber flag. A box beside them held magazines with green followers, banded in stacks. I took one rifle, checked the bore with the discipline I had learned from a corporal who once gave me 10 minutes of careful instruction while waiting for a meeting. The rifle was clean and ready. I took 6 magazines, loaded them into a pouch, and reminded myself that tools are for tasks, not for comfort. The logistics room had the calm an office geets when it paused in the middle of a day and forgot to unpause. Clipboards hung in a grid, shipment manifests with dates and signatures, a map on the wall with pins. 2 cabinets that were usually locked stood broken from their frames. Inside one, boxes of nitrile gloves and disinfectant wipes stacked like bricks. Inside the other, radios with their charging cradles leaning at an angle. I found one handheld radio powered by the emergency circuit, its battery icon 3 bars out of 4. I clipped it to my belt and set it to scan, the volume low, the squelch obedient. In the barracks, the air was dry and still. Duffel bags lay open on bunks, uniforms half folded. A toothbrush sat in a cup in the sink, a line of toothpaste fossilized in the bristles. It felt impolite to look, so I walked softly, stepping where the floor beams were strongest, avoiding the creak patterns I had learned from moving heavy machines at night. In the hallway, I noticed a dark smear at the shoulder height near the turn. It was not wet. I told myself what it was without using words I did not want to carry into the rest of the day. At the motor pool, a sound waited for me. It was a tapping I could not place at first because it was so precisely spaced. A metronome hidden under a layer of echo. The pool's big overhead doors were closed, their lower panels scuffed from years of bumpers. I entered through the sideman door with the small window. The smell hit first: stale diesel, rubber, and something like damp canvas. The tapping carried across the concrete floor, a metal-on-metal contact that had been happening long enough to become its own weather. I followed the sound past the maintenance bay where the tall jack stands lived, past the wall where someone had chalked a calendar of oil changes that would not be done. The tapping pulled me toward the center pillar where vehicles were sometimes chained for load tests. The sight found me before I reached the pillar. A soldier stood, or tried to, his posture held by a restraint chain fixed to a welded ring at the shoulder height. The chain wrapped once around a neck restraint designed to secure a person without crushing. He wore torn fatigues, the fabric gray with oil and time. His eyes were clouded, not with a poet's fog, but with something that belonged to a clinic. His jaw worked without rhythm. His hands flexed as if working an invisible wrench. The tapping was his boot toe against the pillar base each time he strained forward, then reset. I had prepared in my head for empty rooms and closed doors. I had not prepared for this. The restraint had a tag hand-lettered, "Quarantine, await command." It was like seeing a sticky note on a refrigerator. Kind, useless, a promise that the person who wrote it hoped would hold for 15 minutes, not days. The soldier's shirt had a name tape. I looked once and then looked at the floor, memorizing the grid of drain grates instead. He turned toward me with the slow certainty of a person who hears his name in a crowd. His hands reached out, but the chain kept his fingers a foot away from my jacket. I stepped back with the politeness of someone in a crowded elevator. I closed the distance to the maintenance desk, the one with the clipboard and the lockout-tagout station. My hands went to the heavy wrench by instinct, because in a motor pool, a wrench is both language and punctuation. I clipped the wrench to my belt and walked backward to the door, scanning the shadows for movement, breath tamed to a slow, controlled draw. I told myself 3 facts I could hold. The chain was sound, the anchor point was purpose-built, and the restraint was designed by people who had thought about force and leverage and the ways a body bends. I stepped outside into the corridor and closed the door gently, the latch as respectful as if the soldier were asleep. On the way back to the command center, I touched the radio I had clipped to my belt, not to transmit, but to confirm it was there. I did not want to announce myself to anyone or anything that listened. I checked the generator status again because numbers are good anchors. The system drew graphs. The current load had ramped up briefly after the drone launch and then settled. The fuel estimation assumed a rate based on the last 24 hours, which told me 2 comforting things. The system had been running most of the last day, and whoever set the rotation had been careful. The auto-transfer panel showed an exercise of the second generator at 2 a.m. and then a return to the primary unit at 3:15 a.m. That meant whoever had been managing it had trusted the automatic routines. It also meant the alarms had not been acknowledged since a certain time on the evacuation day, because the system kept a list of things it wanted a human to check off, and the list had grown long. I opened the drone feed again after dark because the night is when doubts audition for permanent roles. The sky was clean, a wash of stars corrupted only by the base's faint glow. I launched the drone at minimal altitude to keep the noise down. Over the main gate, I hovered and watched the chain where the padlock sat. The gate itself was secured with a link looped back through steel, a method that keeps a lock from being cut easily. The chain shook once while I watched, A quick rattle that could have been thermal contraction or a breeze. There was no breeze. I nudged the camera left. The thermal overlay cooled the world to flattened tones. In that palette, movement is humility itself. A smudge brightening and fading. I saw 2 smudges against the fence line and then nothing. I pulled back, let the drone settle on the tarmac, and folded it away. Sleep came in blocks measured by the compressor's cycle. In the sealed cold, I counted meals and hours. I inventoried again in the morning, this time with a written list. The field rations gave me a known baseline. The pantry shelves held dry goods, rice, pasta, cooking oil, and spices. Everything labeled in the neat handwriting of civilian kitchen staff who had been good to me on 100 mornings. I took a small container of salt, a bag of rice, a box of tea. I kept my hands steady and my greed disciplined. In the logistics office, I found a torn page on the floor by the printer. It was the top sheet of a pad, the kind people use for quick notes when they are trying to keep track of 5 things at once. The handwriting was sharp and quick. The words read, "Evacuation Order Sierra 4. Do not engage infected personnel. Inside base perimeter." The page had a fold like someone had stuffed it in a pocket and then changed their mind. The instruction was a knife with a dull handle. It told me something I wanted to unknow, that there had been people inside the fence who needed help and did not get it, because the order said not to give it. I replaced the page on the printer where I found it, not because it belonged there, but because I did not want to carry it with me. I spent the afternoon repairing a thing that was not broken. The vending machine in the command lobby had a coin jam, and the bill validator temp sensor was out of calibration. Fixing it was both a ritual and a way to map the building without looking like I was mapping it to anyone who might be looking at me through a lens. I replaced the validator belt and cleaned the optic sensors with a cotton swab. The small engineering felt stable under my hands. I stocked the bottom row with bottled water I took from storage, posting an IOU on the whiteboard as if the board would ever be read by the person it was meant for. That second night, I used the drone again, but I flew it a longer pattern out beyond the perimeter. The residential streets near the highway were dark. A dog barked once and then quieted. At a 4-way intersection, a portable signboard flashed an emergency message on a dead battery, the letters fading midway through the sentence. In the thermal view, a cluster of shapes moved at the edge of a parking lot. They moved together, not as a crowd, but as a small group working the same search. They were not aimless. Their heads lifted and turned in unison as if listening. One stepped forward and then back while the others adjusted. I watched for a long time, interested in motion the way a technician watches a drive belt. For deviation, for pattern. They were following something invisible to me. Heat, sound. Maybe both. They lifted their faces like people who knew to look up because sometimes machines made noise above the ground. I lowered the drone slowly until it rested by its station, then shut the command room lights and sat in the dark, the generators hum a tone that I could find with my teeth. I thought about heat signatures and sound discipline. I thought about the motor pool and the chain. I thought about the words, "Do not engage," and how they carried fear folded into policy. I thought about the day tank levels and the main fuel tank at 40%, which my mind translated to hours, then to days, then to arguments with myself. How long is long enough to gather my strength? How long is too long for the base to hold me without drawing a larger attention than I can handle? Day 3 began with the tapping sound louder than it had been. It reached into the corridor like a polite knock. I had avoided going back because avoidance is a kind of plan when you do not know what a better plan is. I could not avoid it any longer. I armed myself in the small way I understood. A rifle slung so that it lay flat against my chest and did not swing, a wrench on my belt for anything that was not a problem to be solved at distance. a fire extinguisher as an improvised blunt tool, because extinguishers are weight, handle, and purpose in one. The safety pin was in. My finger knew where it was. At the motor pool door, I listened with my ear to the seam as if the door were a living thing. The tapping had a new note in it. A scrape between taps. I pressed the handle and opened quietly. The soldier's posture had shifted. He had worked the chain around to shorten it, not enough to step forward, but enough to change the angle of his reach. He leaned against the restraint and made the small sound that steel makes when it recognizes a human intention behind it. He turned toward me with a focus that felt like a hand on my sleeve. "Hey," I said, because the word is soft and human. He reacted to the sound in the way a person does in a hospital when a nurse whispers their name in a night room. There was no clarity there that I could trust, but there was attention. In that attention, I felt the leftover of the man, the soldier who had done his work in this space. The label on the restraint said await command. I was not command. I could be a person. I could do what I would want someone to do for me if I was in a place like this. But the instruction on the torn page lived in my head now, a ghost of policy wrapped around ethics. I did not move closer. I did not say his name. I watched his eyes, pale and misfiring. The jaw muscle twitched like a motor running against a brake. I stepped back, one careful step, then another, the extinguisher steady in my hand. The chain did its work and held. I closed the door again with the same respect, as if quiet could translate into kindness. In the corridor, I put my back to the wall and counted slowly to 60 because counting occupies the part of the brain that catalogs dread. What changed everything that night was not inside the base. It was at the fence. The perimeter alarms, which had been polite, grew insistent. The command room shifted from gentle advisory tones to a real alert with a red edge. The outer gate camera showed shapes at the chain. Not a crowd at first, but more than a handful. They pressed and then fell back, like people testing their weight against a door in a building evacuation. The chain jerked, the lock stretched, the metal spoke in its own language. I killed interior lights because a dark building is less interesting than a lit one. The generator's sound grew large in my head, the one sound I could not turn off without turning off the base itself. I pulled the drone feed and saw the group at the gate as a brightening and cooling wave. They were not throwing themselves blindly, they were probing. When the generator cycled and the tone changed, faces lifted. It was not confirmation. It was suspicion. I dropped the drone altitude and put it down, not wanting to add one more noise to the night's list. I turned off the monitor brightness until only the green LED at the corner of the screen remained. There's a kind of thinking that happens only when a door starts to fail. It is the thinking that compresses options into a shape you can carry. I assembled my exit plan as if writing a service call checklist. Step 1. Fuel. The emergency key locker in the motor pool had a ring that included the fuel truck. I had delivered snacks to those keys so many times that my hands knew the pattern on the plastic tag. Step 2. Route. The logistics wall map had a lamination glare, but I had stared at it enough to know the lines. A county road up to the ridgeline where the radio tower stood like a tooth. The tower had a maintenance track that was rough but passable. I had refilled machines up there twice during the open days, carrying boxes up the stairs while a contractor replaced a transmitter filter the size of a suitcase. Step 3. Timing. The generator cycles gave me a rhythm. If I ignited during a down cycle on the automatic governor, the base change would mask my starter. The fourth step was a step I did not want to write. The soldier in the motor pool was not a problem of pallets and keys. He was a person in a bind that had lasted too long. Leaving him chained felt like walking past a car with a flat tire and not stopping when you had a pump, but this was not a tire. He was no longer safely reachable. There are tasks I can do with a comfortable margin, and there are tasks I can attempt only if what waits on the other side is worth the cost of getting them wrong. I had to choose. I stood at the door and listened. The tapping had its rhythm again. Between taps, a scrape. I held the extinguisher like a tool and walked inside. He turned, the chain tightened, the restraint did its designed job. I closed the distance to the edge of his reach. I could see now that his hands bore small marks, like he had tried 100 times to work the buckle with fingers that did not remember how. I spoke softly. I did not tell him it would be fine. I did not lie. I spoke to the part of him that could still hear tone and cadence. "You're not alone," I said. "I'm sorry." The words were plain enough to hold weight without adding anything the world would punish me for later. I lifted the extinguisher. I had done safety training in kitchens under a poster that said pull, aim, squeeze, sweep. The safety pin on the extinguisher came free with the ring. I did not need the chemical. I needed the cylinder's weight and the flat of it. I waited until he leaned, until the chain held him, and then I stepped in and used the tool the way you would use a tool to save someone from more pain. There was no spectacle. There was the dull contact and the stop. The motor pool air waited for another sound and did not get one. I set the extinguisher down carefully on its base. I stepped back to the door and stood with my hand on the frame, breathing slowly until my hands stopped shaking. The chain hung with a new slack. I spoke again, the same 2 words I had used. "I'm sorry." Then I closed the door with respect, because a door is the last witness to what a room has seen. The perimeter alarm tripped into a new phase just before midnight. The gate chain sounded like a dropped wrench. The hum of the generator felt enormous, as if the bass had become a drum and I was sitting inside it. I hurried the timing. The emergency key locker surrendered the tag I needed with a twist. The motor pool's side bay had a medium fuel truck with a full tank because it had been scheduled for a morning run that would never happen. The clipboard showed a route that traced to the main and auxiliary tanks. The truck's ignition said it would start if the starter got the current it wanted. I loaded the cab with what I could lift in one carry from the mess hall. A half case of field rations, 2-gallon jugs of water, a bag of rice I could use as ballast or food, the radio, the rifle with the sling cinched short, the wrench, and a first aid kit I knew only a little how to use. I left a note on the command console in block letters that said, "Generator fuel 40%, cameras and drones operational, revolving down cycle around 2 a.m. If you come back and read this, I hope you are safe." I did not sign it. I waited for the generator to dip. The control screen trembled and then settled as it had the previous night. The tone shifted 2 notes down the scale. I turned the key, the starter engaged, and the engine coughed twice before finding its run. The cab vibrated like a handshake. I slipped the transmission into gear and rolled out, keeping the lights off until the last possible second. The overhead door rose 6 inches, then 12, then 36 with a slow, patient roll. I eased the truck through the gap just as the door topped out. At the perimeter, the cameras recorded what I heard and felt. The gate chain gave up one of its links, the lock fell against the fence in a bright clatter, and the gap became a mouth. They entered not like a sea, but like a team that has found a door unlatched. They flowed with purpose and then fanned out. I cut the corner out of the motor pool lot through the secondary exit, the one I had used twice when construction blocked the main lane. The engine sound bounced off the block walls and then was swallowed by the open air. The command room video wall probably still showed the feed for another minute before the power controller dimmed the monitors to save fuel for the night and no one saw anything. I turned onto the service road and then onto the county road, keeping my speed steady and my hands light. The main gate receded in the mirrors, a rectangle that no longer described safety. The dashboard's instrument lights glowed a careful green. The road was a piece of film and a projector with the audio track missing. Off to the right, the ridge rose in a black hummock. The radio tower's red obstruction light blinked a rhythm that had been part of my drives for years without me noticing. Now, I counted it without meaning to. I took the turn onto the maintenance track a quarter-mile before the tower. The truck climbed and the cab bounced. The track was rutted, but the truck did not care. At the top, the lattice tower stood inside a fence with a gate I could lift off its hinges because the hinge pins were externally mounted. I did not like that about the gate when I had seen it last year. I did not like it now. I parked the truck close to the equipment building and killed the engine. The night rushed in with a hiss like a valve opening. The tower site had a small building with a keypad. I had watched a contractor tap while carrying a box of replacement snacks up 30 steps. I did not have the code, but I knew the building's backup generator made a different sound than the one at the base. It was a smaller unit, rated for a few hours at a time to keep the transmitters alive during outages. It did not sound now. I wedged my multi-tool into the latch plate and bent the soft metal back enough to catch the tongue with my wrench. The door opened into a room that smelled like electronics on a rainy day. Ozone, dust, a hint of warm plastic. I did two things in that room that were both ordinary and at the border of what I considered my skill. I checked the breaker panel with my flashlight, and I checked the transceiver rack for anything that looked overheated. The breaker that fed the cabinet lights was on. The lights worked. The transmitters had status lights that blinked an error pattern I did not know by heart, but recognized as, "We need input." I set the rifle in the corner, shouldered the extinguisher, and inspected the backup generator. It was a small diesel unit with a day tank that had been left at a quarter full. The battery gave me one crank and then surrendered. I swapped it for a spare on the shelf. The starter spun and the diesel caught with a cough. The gauge settled. The small building grew a heartbeat. I kept the generator running long enough to bring up a simple radio link. I did not transmit on any channel that might have been privileged. I used the local repeater's public access and sent 2 words. "Any station?" Then I waited 5 minutes and sent them again. A voice came back only once, a woman who said, "Please, if you can read this, conserve your battery. We are sheltering at the library. We cannot move. We hear them at night." There was a tone in her voice that I would carry like an inventory item. I wrote down the frequency, the time, and the 2 facts that mattered. Library, cannot move. At dawn, I walked the perimeter of the tower site. The chain-link fence had 3 spots where the bottom rail loosened from its fasteners, the kind of maintenance item that waits months because nothing bad has happened yet. I used an old length of wire from my truck's tool bin to fish the rail back into alignment and cinched it with loops. I moved the truck so the rear bumper pressed against the gate to add weight. I set up a sleeping area inside the equipment room. A tarp, a folded jacket as a pillow, a water jug, and a ration pack. I gave myself permission to breathe. From the ridge I could see the base's roofs, flat hexagons against the lighter ground. A smoke ribbon rose from the generator stack, thin and honest. The main gate was blocked now by vehicles that had not been there at midnight. Either a group had tried to get in during the night and left their cars as a barrier, or something inside had pushed out, which I did not want to picture. I focused on the practical. I had a place to sleep, I had food, I had a modest signal path to people who might answer, and I had an engine I could run for short bursts to do work. The 3rd day, on the ridge, I built schedules. Schedules are the bones you hang your hours on so they do not collapse. I set waking at 5 a.m. I set generator exercise for 15 minutes at 6 a.m. to warm the building and power the transceivers. I set a transmission window at 6:10 a.m. for messages to anyone listening, then another at 6:40 a.m. to check for delayed replies. I set a midday quiet hour to conserve food and energy, and a late afternoon maintenance block to check the fence, the generator, and my own hands and feet for cuts that could become bigger problems. I set an evening drone window because I had brought one of the base's drones with me, the second unit that had sat in its dock patient as a cat. I flew the drone lower in the hills than I had at the base. The thermal view made deer into glowing commas among the trees. On the first evening, I saw a small group moving up the service road. 5 figures in a line, stepping when the lead stepped, stopping when the lead stopped. They did not speak. They moved like people listening for equipment warnings. I watched them cross the road and then continued toward the next rise. They were not coming to the tower. They were going somewhere else on purpose. My mind wanted to assign them names and stories. I did not let it. On the 5th day, I returned to the base because the numbers required it. The tower site would need more diesel if I was going to keep the generator alive for short windows. The base still had fuel, and if it still had power, then its systems were still working enough to allow a quick raid. I did not go at night. I went in mid-morning when the groups I had watched seemed less active. I drove down the ridge with the truck in low gear and the windows cracked enough to hear the world. The base's perimeter cameras still turned. The generator still exhaled smoke. The secondary motor pool entrance was my goal because I could avoid the main gate. The lot had marks like a diagram of a task done in a hurry. Scuff lines where tires had spun, an air hose dragged across the concrete. A toolbox tipped over. I reached the fuel station and filled the truck's transfer tank quickly, one eye on the meter, one ear on the kind of silence that comes before interruption. I shut the valve at 100 gallons, enough to keep the tower alive for many short runs if I was disciplined. On my way back through the motor pool, I paused at the door. The air inside felt different even before I saw the chain. The restraint hung with a sag the designer did not intend. The world had moved while I was away. Just a fraction. Just enough to remind me that no decision is ever the last one you will have to make. I walked softly to the maintenance desk and lifted a folded tarp. I covered the space with it, a small courtesy for a space that had held a hard thing. I wrote one more note, not to anyone in particular. If you were here, I did not forget you. I left it under the wrench on the desk. Back on the ridge, I refined my schedules to include a daily call on the frequency of the voice that had answered. The library. I kept my transmission short and plain. This is a civilian on the ridge. I have limited power. If you need specific supplies, say so. If you cannot move by day, say what you can say. 3 days later, at 6:12 a.m., the voice again. We need water filters and basic first aid. We have children. We cannot move safely because the group returns each night. She did not say the words I refused to say. She did not need to. The line clicked and guttered with static. I brought up a pad of paper and wrote down a list. Filters, bandages, disinfectant, gauze, tape, a calming voice. The list meant I had to go back into the logistics building, where the broken cabinets held what I needed. I considered the road to the library. It cut through a line of houses where the bus sat like a still photograph. It passed the park where the portable sign still flashed the half message. It ended at a building with a glass facade and broad steps. The steps would make a bottleneck. The windows would catch a reflection. I made a map from memory and from the drone's camera. I circled a side entrance where deliveries came. I penciled in trees that could hide a methodical approach. The next morning, I was in the logistics room at the base when I heard a noise that did not belong to any machine. It was a voice, but not speech, a tone that rises when air tries to describe an intent through a throat that should rest. It came from the barracks hallway. I lifted the rifle and moved against the wall the way a technician moves around live equipment, No sudden contact, no grazing a grounded surface. The sound repeated. I leaned just far enough to see a figure in the hallway, swaying, hands testing the wall. The movement was small, patient, the way a craftsman tests a joint to see if it will fail. I stepped back without letting my boots slide. The figure continued toward the door where the dark smear was at shoulder height. It found the smear with its palm and pressed. It was building a map, one mark at a time. I left with 2 boxes of water filters, a crate of first aid supplies, and a coil of rope. I loaded the truck and kept my eyes on the ground in front of my boots as I crossed the lot, not to avoid seeing something, but to keep my mind small and quiet. I drove out through the secondary exit, past the service yard, and onto the road. The mirrors showed me the base growing small again. Delivering to the library was equal parts route planning and silence management. I approached from the far side, using the service alley behind the building. I parked the truck 2 blocks away and carried the boxes a third of the way, then waited and listened. The alley had a dumpster with a lid that slammed in the wind. I wedged it with a broken pallet so it would not betray me. I advanced and set the boxes down behind a loading dock. I waited again. Then I tapped the handheld radio twice and spoke quietly. I am behind the library at the loading dock. I am leaving boxes. I will step away. You can collect after I go. A voice came back after a long minute. Understood. That was all. I left the boxes and walked away, counting my steps so I did not run. Back at the tower, I watched the drone video with the restraint of a person who knows that being an observer does not make you a participant. 2 figures darted from the library door to the dock, grabbed the boxes, and disappeared. Later that night, the thermal view showed a small flare of warmth in the library like a stove or a space heater, and the tiny motion of people taking turns sleeping. And I slept too, not because the world was safe, but because the world will not negotiate with a person who never closes their eyes. Days became a ledger of actions. I refueled the tower generator and measured amounts to keep the day tank from growing stale. I flew the drone to watch the road patterns that changed almost imperceptibly. A car door that was closed one day and opened the next. A figure that came out of a house, stood, and returned. A group that crossed a parking lot with patient spacing. I made 3 more deliveries to the library, always in day hours, always behind the building, always with the radio message short and simple. Each time, a thank you came as steady as a transaction in a store I had stocked for years. Once, on the road back to the ridge, I saw a woman standing at the edge of her yard, holding a shovel like a flag. She watched the truck and did not wave. Her eyes tracked me in a straight line. She stood with her feet set like someone bracing to lift. I raised my hand in a gesture that said I saw her and would not alter my path. She watched me pass and then lowered the shovel, turned, and walked into her house. I thought of doors and chains and the kindness of small routines. The base did not remain quiet. One afternoon, while I topped off the tower's day tank, the drone camera picked up motion at the base motor pool that was too purposeful to be wind and too consistent to be the animals that use the edges of roads as their own highways. A group moved along the wall, 5 or 6, spacing themselves like a team, making entry. They went past the motor pool door where I had stood with my hand on the frame. They continued to the logistics wing and then stopped as if reading a sign. After a moment, they moved as one toward the admin building, where the camera blinked and then fell to black. The generator continued to hum. That night, the smoke from its stack thinned, and then the next morning, the system's thermal signature had cooled by 2 notches. The base was still alive, but it was living on the lower branch of the curve. I watched the fuel numbers in my notebook and drew a line to the day when the base generators would be hard to revive without filters I did not have. I considered going back one more time to gather oil and belts and the small parts that turn a day into a week. But each trip carried a cost that accumulated like wear on a bearing. You do not feel it until it heats all at once. I decided to let the base go to rest on its own. It had given me what I could ask: food, shelter, tools, and a road. I told the library on the radio that I might not be able to continue daily check-ins because my fuel would be needed for other tasks. The voice said, "We understand. We may try to move in 2 days if the road looks quiet." I said, "If you go in day hours and keep your group small and tight. Do not stop near glass, plan your stops. If you have to choose the open with visibility over the cover that echoes." I realized I was speaking like a technician describing a machine that does not like sudden loads. She said, "We will try to do it that way." 2 days later, they left. I knew because the drone video showed a line of 6 figures moving along the painted edge of the road, staying tight to the curb, pausing only at the empty bus where the door yawned. They did not look at the bus. They did not touch the open suitcase. At the corner, they turned into the light without rushing. A parked car's side mirror caught a flare of sunlight and then went dark. The group moved out of the drone's range, and I did not chase them with the camera, because a person deserves a piece of their life unobserved. In the quiet that followed, I cleaned the tower building as if someone else would be the next to use it. I wiped down the transceiver rack, swept the dust from the corners, and left a laminated instruction card I wrote in thick marker. Generator run, 15 minutes morning and night for comms and heat. Check oil daily. Conserve fuel. Use radio at 6:10 a.m. I wrote the frequencies. I left the half case of rations in a stack. I topped up the day tank and secured the gate with the truck pressed against it. A doorstop of 2 tons of steel. I took the rifle and the wrench and the radio and walked to the truck cab. When I turned the key, the engine started with the familiar cough, and the ridge road opened like a ribbon ready to be cut. I drove not toward the base and not toward the town. I drove along the shoulder of the hills, choosing for the first time in days not based on a schedule but based on a map I could not draw. The map of places where people store equipment and seldom visit. Places with maintenance buildings, fences that can be secured with a little thought, and doors that open with respect for their hinges. I did not say out loud the lesson the base had taught me because saying things makes them permanent. I kept it on the small screen in my head where I keep repair codes and part numbers and the little tricks that make a machine hum. The last time I looked back at the tower, the red light at the top blinked its careful, slow warning to a sky that held no aircraft. The base roofs sat flat in the distance, the generator's smoke thin as a pencil line. The Humvee at the gate had not moved. The chain hung with its broken link bright in the sun. Somewhere down the slope, a dog barked twice and then gave up. I tightened my hands on the wheel and took the next turn as if it had always been my route. I said something then, not a motto and not a conclusion, just the kind of sentence that fits the cab of a truck and does not offend the air. "I came here for safety," I said quietly. "What I found was the truth. Nowhere left is safe, only time bought." And then I drove. The road was a ledger and I was good at ledgers. I marked my miles not in numbers but in decisions. Stop here or not. Take the high line or the low. Use power now or later. Answer a voice or hold back. I slept when the light was right, and when the place had angles I could trust. I ate when my mind began to make mistakes. I kept the radio on the dash like a friendly animal and talked to it at 6:10 a.m. and 6:40 a.m., and sometimes at noon if the sky felt kind. On a day without a date, I found a water treatment substation I had serviced once with bottled drinks for a contractor team. It had a cinder block control room with a heavy door and a small generator on a concrete pad. The lock pins were accessible. The fence had a top rail I could fortify with a length of chain I carried for towing. I checked the chlorination system and found it dormant, the tanks safe in their chemistry and the lines depressurized. I rolled out a hose and filled my jugs from a bypass line after flushing it for a full 5 minutes. I boiled what I took later to be sure, because water is a simple task you should never disrespect. Another day, the drone showed a figure sitting on the hood of a car in a lot, back against the windshield, feet on the bumper, hands folded, head down, the posture of someone resting. I hovered a minute longer than I should have and then pulled back because I had learned to let scenes exist without me. In the evening, the ridge wind made the tower light flicker and then steady. I adjusted the guy wires at the fence line and secured the loose end of a strap that had been slapping a rhythm like a heartbeat. The rifle stayed clean and quiet. The wrench grew familiar in my hand. The fire extinguisher sat where I could reach it with my eyes closed. I wrote in my notebook the way I used to record which machines ate bills and which just needed a little patience. Base generator, prime, tower generator, standby, fuel, track daily, drone, charge cycle, radio, schedule. On the last page, I wrote the sentence from the torn log, "Do not engage infected personnel inside base perimeter." Then I added my own. "Engage the world with care. Do what you can. Do not do what you cannot undo." I do not know where the road ends. I know where it began. At a gate I used to pass with a wave, at a mess hall where I knew the sound a door makes when it seals, at a command room where a video wall glowed like a promise that turned into a mirror. I know that a person can become a schedule, and a schedule can become a life, and that this is not a defeat if what the schedule buys you is the room to be humane in the small places where it matters. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support keeps these creepypastas coming. Until next time, stay alert, stay safe, and never ignore the feeling that something is watching.